We're going to be working with creating rollovers using CSS and CSS only. This technique does not use any JavaScript, which is traditionally how you would be able to create more graphical type rollovers on web pages. So this is a great technique to use. It is going to automatically preload our images that we're going to be using, and all we need to do is basically create some CSS to be able to control this. This is once again a starting point for more complex use of creating graphical rollover type images in CSS, but I like this technique because it works really well. This is the page that we're going to be starting with, and basically I have some links up here, and they're actually wrapped in a div that I've called nav. The reason that I put them up here in this div is in case I have other links somewhere else on my page, I don't want them to take on the same style. So what we're going to do is we're going to transform these links so that they look more like a button. I'm going to be using this graphic down here to do so. So the graphic that I'm going to be using is just one graphic. It is 300 pixels wide by 40 pixels high, and we'll be using this to create these buttons, and this is a really great technique to be able to use. So here's our code, and it's a fairly simple page. As I said, I have a div called ID nav, and it basically is wrapping around all the links on my page. Then I have just paragraph and an H3 and multiple paragraphs that are here, and that's pretty much it for my page. As for my CSS, the only things that I've defined thus far are assigning a font family, a font size, and a width on my body. So my body is fixed width. As I scroll my page bigger or smaller, you can see that the content doesn't change at all. And I have gone ahead and made a class called border, and that class is being used on this image right here. And the only reason that I have that is that so you can clearly see that this is one image as opposed to three separate images sitting side by side. So I just assign my class of border to that particular image that's on my page, and you can see that this is just one image that's hanging out on my page. So let's go ahead and let's begin by creating the navigation links and making this a little bit more interesting overall. Probably the first thing that I really want to do is, well, let's go ahead and create some links on the A tags. So I'm going to begin by calling nav A and nav A link. So I'll be styling all of the links basically that are going to reside inside my nav div, which are this bit of text up here. The first thing that we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to find some width and height values of our particular A tag. Now if I go ahead and just type in, for instance, height, and I assign that to be 40 pixels, and I go ahead and I assign the width to be 100 pixels, and we save and we refresh our page, you're going to see that nothing really happens. And that's because by default A tags are inline, they're not block level elements. So what I need to do is I need to specify my A tag as being a block level element so it'll actually display the height and width values that we're going ahead and requesting. So I'm going to go ahead and type in display, and I will choose that I want my display to be block. And now if I save and refresh my page, you can see that my elements are going to stack on top of each other, and that is a default behavior of a block level element. If we were to come in here and just turn on our borders, and I'm just going to copy paste this temporarily and go ahead and refresh this, you can see where the borders are. So they are 40 pixels high and 100 pixels wide. So basically by turning these into block level elements, it does go ahead and recognize my width and height values, but it also goes ahead and puts the images stacked one on top of another. In this particular example, I want my buttons to be horizontal, so I'm going to go ahead and use a float to do that. So we'll go ahead and use our float value, and I'm going to float all my images left. And if I save and refresh, you're going to now see that our buttons do float left as we want them to, but my text also comes up here. I don't want the text to be floated to the left of these images. So we already know a quick way to do that. I need to basically tell this paragraph to clear these floats. And the easiest and quickest way is for me just to put an additional div down here that I can and create a style for this div as well. And we'll just clear the floats that are being used. So I'm going to assign a class. I'm going to go ahead and call it clear. And then we'll just go ahead and make a comment in here. And then we'll go ahead and we'll close this div. So now I have my div in here. If I save my page and refresh, nothing of course is going to change because I haven't styled that div. So let's go back up here and let's make a style for dot class. And I'm going to go ahead and specify that I want to clear both, or even just left would be fine since I'm not floating anything. As I said before, I usually put both in here because clear is just such a general class that I use on pretty much every web page. It can be used to clear right or left floated items, so it makes more sense to have it clear both. But now let's go ahead and, oh, look what I did up here. I named this dot class instead of dot clear. Be helpful to name it the same name as I named my class down there. All right, now you can see that my paragraph wraps around. So this is looking more, you know, like I want it to look. Let's go ahead and let's address how visually these items look. I would like them to basically display on top of these graphics right here. So we're going to do that next. I'm going to come back here and I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of my border. I'll actually maybe put a border width on here. And just to ensure, since these are going to be links, I don't want them to have any sort of border width, and it's always a good idea to just turn the border width to 0 when you're dealing with links. So I'm going to go ahead and specify that. And the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to assign a background image to my A tag. So I'm going to use background image, and then of course I need to specify the location of my image. So I'm going to use URL, and in parentheses I will go ahead and put the path to the image. So my images are located in a folder called images, and the file that I'm looking for is called buttonbg.jpg. And then I just have to close my parentheses and terminate with a semicolon, of course. And if I save and refresh, you're going to see that I do see that background image now appearing underneath all my links. So this is perfect. This is exactly how I want this to look. Well, maybe not exactly, but it's definitely getting closer. So now what I want to do is I want to control how the text is interacting on these images, on top of these images. First of all, I certainly don't want the text to be this color, and I need to adjust its spacing a little bit. So let me just tell you a little bit how I designed this graphic in Photoshop. I basically took a file and made a 300 pixel wide file by 40 pixels high. Each of these buttons are intended to take up about 100 pixels worth of space. Now you can see I do have a little drop shadow underneath, so my drop shadow is actually taking up some space here as well. So we're going to have to keep that in mind when we go and align this. So let me show you what happens if I go ahead and align my text. So we'll come in here, and the first thing that we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll get rid of the text decoration. So I'm going to set my text decoration to none, which will get rid of that underline. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to specify the color of my text, and we'll just go ahead and set it to white. And let's go ahead and let's set the font weight to make these kind of stand out a little bit from the rest of the text that's going to be on here. So we'll set that up to be bold. And these are just styling things, of course. If I save and refresh, you can see that now I've just styled the text to be white, bold, and gone ahead and gotten rid of the underline underneath. So now what I'm going to do is I'd like my text to kind of be centered on my buttons. So because my text is all different, you know, widths, the easiest way for me to do that is basically just to use the text align. So I'm going to go ahead and specify text align, and I'm going to set that to be center. Now if we save and refresh, you'll see what happens. It does center align my text, but it's actually center aligning my text based on the 100 pixel width of my div. And if I was to actually come back here and turn my borders back on again, let's just copy this real quick. And I'll save so you can see. You can see that this box is 100 pixels, so this is centering it within the 100 pixels. Optically, it's not centering on our buttons because part of my 100 pixels is this drop shadow that appears to the right hand side. You can see that my buttons pretty much start about 1 pixel in, but the problem is I have about, 8 to 10 pixels worth of space that account for the drop shadow over here. So how am I going to make that work? I'm going to basically make that work utilizing my padding and margin settings. So let's go ahead and let's fix those. The first thing that I want to do is I want to bring these down a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to use some padding on the top to vertically align my text. Let's go ahead and let's just, you know what, I'll just comment this out for right now, and we'll go ahead and we'll leave the the borders on, so while we're discussing this you can kind of see what's happening, but just so these don't kind of interfere with each other since they're giving different instructions, I'm going to go ahead and leave those on, and we'll just get rid of those and uncomment this out when we're finished here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set my padding, and I'm going to go ahead and use padding top to be able to push the text away from the top of this, and the value that I want to use is going to be 7 pixels, so I'm going to go ahead and type that in. Now if I save and refresh, you can see that my text is going to move down. It is also going ahead and it's going to repeat my image because, as we know, padding is going to add to the overall height of your image. So what I really need to do is I need to also subtract 7 pixels from the height of my image. So I've already defined a width of 40 pixels. If I subtract 7 from that, that's going to give me 33. So if I save and refresh, now you don't see the repeat happening back there, which is fine, that's what I want. And now my text is nice and centered within those images. It still is a little bit farther away from this left-hand edge than I would like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an adjustment on the width and use padding to accommodate the size of the box. I know that the width of the graphical part of my button is 92 pixels. So I'm going to actually change my width value from 100 pixels here to 92 pixels. And if I was to save and refresh the page at this point, you can see that optically the text does align center on my buttons, and that looks much better, but I'm losing that nice drop shadow that I have over here to the right. So now I want to add that drop shadow back in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use padding to do that. So I'll use a padding right value of 8 pixels to add that back in. It's going to basically 92 plus 8 is going to give me 100. So if we refresh the page now, you can see that the text stays centered, but now I see that drop shadow on the right. So that solves that problem. I'd like to have a little bit more spacing in between my buttons themselves, so we'll use a little margin right to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and set my right margin to 5 pixels just to give these a little bit of breathing room. So if we refresh again over here, you can see that now it pushes these away from each other. So that's looking pretty great. I am definitely pretty happy with how my buttons look. At this point, there is no rollover functionality, they're just buttons. Now, everything's generated with CSS. This image actually doesn't exist on our HTML content. You can see how minimal my HTML content is for this. This is all I have right here. The images are all being generated in our CSS. Let's go ahead and let's get rid of this border because we don't need this anymore. Now you can see where the border is, and I'm going to uncomment my border width 0 that I had and reload the page, and I have a nice looking navigation bar. Let's go ahead and let's create the rollover functionality next, and then I'm going to do that very quickly and easily by creating a style first of all for my nav a:hover. So we'll do hover first. And in this example, I'm just going to use hover and active. I won't use a visited, but you need to make sure that you keep your link attributes, your pseudo class attributes in the right order. Remember, we talked about the little shortcut of love ha. You always want to do link, visited link, hover, and then active. And then, of course, if you're going to skip over one of those, you can just kind of ignore it. But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to adjust the background position of my graphic right there. So what I want to do is when you're hovering, I want to show this yellow state of my button instead of the red state. I've designed this graphic so that it is 100 pixels wide. It's going to take up this first state. So basically, if I just move my graphic over to the left 100 pixels, that should display our yellow state of the button. And that's exactly what I'm going to do here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to specify that my positioning here gets moved over to the left, horizontally to the left by negative 100 pixels. That'll move it to the left. Positive numbers would move it to the right, negative would move it to the left. And I'm just going to go ahead and throw 0 for vertical so it doesn't move vertically at all. And just for fun, let's go ahead and let's change the color attribute of the text. And I'm going to go ahead and plug in a value that basically is picking up the same red color right here that I had used to design my graphics. So that is a value of AE311F. And if I save and refresh, you're going to see that I have these wonderful little rollover functionalities now on all my buttons, which is exactly what I wanted. So this is really, really cool that you can create rollovers. No JavaScript. I'm just using CSS to do this. And basically my image is instantly loaded as soon as the page is loaded. It's just temporarily hidden. So the load time for this would be pretty minimal anyways, but this is a great technique because you can load something while it's basically not showing on your page. Let's go ahead and let's add the active link style next. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to do a nav a active, and we're basically going to use the same bit of code that we used here. I'll just copy paste it and change a couple of the attributes. My background position now, I want to show the orange button, which basically is 200 pixels over. So I'm just going to change this number right here to 200. That'll move the graphic to the left by 200 pixels. And we'll just change the color of the text to display gray. So now when I save the page, if I reload the page, you can see that while I'm clicking down, I see the active state. Now, I'm not a super big fan of active states because usually if someone's really using their web page, they're just going to click and they'll probably never see it. But I used it in this demonstration just to show you that it is possible to actually assign values for all states. So you could do a visited, an active, a hover, and a link. I would just make a graphic with 4 different colors if I wanted to. I just didn't do visited because it's kind of hard to show with these null links, but you can see that everything is working appropriately, and I think that this is just a wonderful technique. I use it all the time to create rollovers. Pure CSS keeps your page nice and light, and it'll basically work on all browsers. So hopefully you'll get a lot of mileage out of this technique for creating rollovers using pseudo classes and a little bit of CSS.